All right. Hello, folks. My name is Jared Monshine. I am the Director of Research at the U.S. Study Center. Thanks so much for joining us today. First, before we get started, want to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. So, a year from today, we're going to be in the thick of elections, or an election in particular. And the U.S. Study Center, we do a lot of things, as you can see in our motto here, which has gotten longer in recent years. We do a lot. We study U.S. politics, talk about foreign policy, talk about U.S. strategic thinking, talk about U.S.-Australia ties, but there's nothing that actually drives our audiences and drives eyeballs and clicks to our website more than just good old American politics. We this year, or last week, had our inaugural event called the Sydney International Strategic Forum. And we had Ryan and Olivia next to me here alongside other notable folks ranging from Michelle Flournoy, Barack Obama's Undersecretary for Defense, to Phil Davidson, Indo-Pacific Command Commander, and Evan Medeiros, who is President Obama's China Director on the National Security Council. We had a lot of these folks all in a conference just on Wednesday last week. But one thing we want to do, because the thirst for U.S. domestic politics is so high, we want to actually have just one good old what's coming next on the election discussion with Ryan and Olivia. So you probably saw in the invitations who Ryan and Olivia are, but I'll quickly say their bios. Olivia, to my right here, is the Washington correspondent for New York Magazine. She's previously worked at the Daily Beast and published in everywhere from Politico and GQ to the Washington Post, and is a fantastic reporter for finding the scoops about the Trump administration in particular. We were talking about this earlier today, some fantastic New York Magazine cover stories with her exclusive interviews of Trump. And then we have her fiance, Ryan Lizza, and he is the Washington correspondent for Politico. He's also worked at New Yorker, at the New Republic, and has been in covering Washington politics since 1994.
1998.
98, excuse me. Sorry, don't want to date you. And the two of them combined are just an exceptional wealth of knowledge, not only of Washington and politics in general, but also the sort of meta story and why things are happening, and not just doing the meaningless scoops, but actually like really thinking critically about what's going on and what it all means. So I wanted to have this event so we could have a conversation, talk about, as the proper insiders, to give us an idea of what's coming next, but also for the last half hour or so, allow the audience to ask, and I should know, ask, not speechify or bloviate, questions of our distinguished guests. So with that, let's just get started. For those of us, I briefly mentioned your bios, but could you maybe just give us an idea of, we discussed this earlier today, but how you ended up covering your beats and what your beats are exactly, so you can sort of set the stage for we know where your insights are coming from?
All right. So I'm the chief Washington correspondent for Politico, and I also co-write a daily newsletter, and every day, 365 days a year, about American politics, that if you're interested in American politics, I highly recommend you subscribe to it. It's called Politico Playbook. And I also host and produce a weekly podcast about American politics. And in fact, just got finished doing a show here with the two hosts of Planet America, and actually learned quite a bit about American politics from two Australians, which was kind of the focus of the show, is why are you all so obsessed with American politics? And how is it that you know so much? So it's a little intimidating to talk to these crowds, because I've found myself stumped as I've been interacting with very, very knowledgeable Australian political junkies. And I cover presidential politics for the most part, but Congress, the White House, and presidential campaigns.
I am the Washington correspondent for New York
Is that on?
It's on now.
There we are.
Yeah. Okay. I am an audio technician. I am the Washington correspondent for New York Magazine. I've had that role since right around the time of Trump's inauguration. I started covering Trump pretty early in 2014, right before he started his campaign for the White House. And I sort of was either blessed or cursed with that beat, depending on how you look at it, and have kind of been seeing it through since then. I write sort of feature stories and in-depth profiles about the people who influence presidential politics and politicians in their decision making. So I'd say I'm interested a lot in character and, you know, why people believe what they believe and why they do what they do. And yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. Now, before I should clarify, before Ryan and Olivia arrived here today, actually before they did any events, I told them that speaking to an audience in Australia, you should treat them similar to a DC audience, and that they have read basically the same thing that the same things that a DC audience would read. They just sometimes hadn't been there physically, right? So,
Yeah.
you know, you might hear, for example, I said like the Cafe Milano set in DC, or something like that, and this audience may not know, but living there, you actually have tangible knowledge of that. But this audience would know 538. This audience would know Politico very well. This audience knows far too much. There's
We're gonna see if we can stump you all.
exactly, yeah. There's one of my favorite Australianisms that I've learned is in sports you have tragics. That's like a fan of the team. Like I go for the Minnesota Vikings, and I'm a
But like a team that always loses.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Consistently loses more than anyone else. Thank you. Yeah, I'm a tragic, but we also have politics tragics. So I guess one thing I want to know, though, as I said, maybe this audience hasn't been there physically, is you, Olivia, have covered Trump rallies arguably more than anyone in terms of the mainstream media, having been there personally. Could you maybe talk us through what is it actually like at a Trump rally, and what was it like in 2016, 2020, and maybe the most recent rallies? Like, how have they shifted? So you were one of the first, or you were one of a number of journalists, including Jonathan Swan, who started covering Trump before he was sort of a serious candidate in 2016. But how have those rallies actually changed, the physical presence of being there?
You know, they're much less well attended by the media now. It's I'm sure you've seen at the kind of classic Trump rally, there's a moment where he instructs his audience to turn around and look at the press pen and look at the fake news media, and to, you know, kind of boo us all in there. And that's not really, I mean, he still does that a little bit, but it's all right-wing media now who's attending, and you get a couple of mainstream reporters here and there. You get a couple of people from like TV networks with their cameras, but it's not like a zoo in there anymore. It's not a must cover event for the mainstream press in America. So that's probably one of the biggest differences. The speech itself, I mean, he adds new things in, or gets kind of fixated on whatever he's obsessed with at the moment, but it's sort of just the same stream of consciousness, list of grievances, and his running commentary on different things. They're sort of more avant-garde than they used to be. They're very strange. Beforehand, there's like the Trump rally playlist, so you hear the same songs over and over again. It's like a
Elton John
Tiny Dancer. You've got some Rolling Stones. Hasn't ruined it for me, which I think is remarkable. A real testament to how good that music is. Rolling Stones, Elton John, Memory from Cats. That's always a weird one. But he started to play the last few rallies I've noticed on the kind of projection screens. He's been playing Elton John's live rendition of the Who's Where's Tommy? I think it's, or Tommy, can you hear me?
Tommy,
Yeah, but one of the specific
Yeah.
songs, and the entire
Yes.
video plays before Trump comes on. He's also been playing a lot of Elvis performances on the screen before he comes
Like
on.
recorded Elvis.
No, yeah. It's getting very weird, basically. And it's sort of, the people who show up there, it depends on what time it is. If it's a weekday, middle of the day rally, the crowd tends to be sort of more hardcore people who would take time in the middle of a workday, or older people who maybe are retired. But there are also just a lot of people who are there because the Trump show is rolling into town. And I think it's sort of an opportunity for them to have a sense of community with people, and to tailgate, and to listen to the greatest hits of the last half century. And it's a weird mix of Trump obsessives and people who are just sort of there to rubberneck at this chaos in front of them.
And Ryan, to you, in terms of how the things have changed since 2016. In 2016, we are reporting on the tweets, right? And we're talking about this earlier today, how it used to be that with politicians, you could just say, X politician says, quote, and that was the story, right? And with Trump, I think, especially near the last few years of his administration, the media sort of stopped doing that to a certain extent, because they just realized it was a lot of noise. But how has your coverage, personally, but also the media in general, how has that shifted, would you say, from 2016 to now, in terms of understanding Trump and actually trying to add context to what he's doing?
Yeah, a few things. I think one on the rallies, just to add to your point. I mean, is anyone here like a Grateful Dead fan, or Fish, or any of these bands that have very hardcore followings, and that like to go to every show? There's a little bit of that quality to the Trump rallies, whereas 2016 was maybe like Grateful Dead, and like Grateful Dead 72 was like smaller, a little more intimate, but they were a little wilder in their playing. And like now it's like 1980s Grateful Dead. They're playing big stadiums. The same fans are there. There's a couple of few bells and whistles that they've added to the performance, but it's like a very, very, very different vibe. On the coverage of Trump, look, he has. I was just doing this podcast with John and Chaz from Planet America, and one of the points that I thought was really smart from Chaz was that Trump, in a way, has allowed Americans to see all of the vulnerabilities of our system, because he tests everything. He tested the primary system, and whether Republican elites and Republican elected officials really had sway anymore in their own internal party electoral system. And it turns out they didn't anymore. The voters had totally taken over that system. It's been democratized. Back not that long ago, party bosses decided who the nominee was, and someone like Donald Trump could never get through that system. He's testing our justice system right now with a number of these cases, and some of the fights that are happening. The one this week is a gag order. He's appealed this gag order that may go to our Supreme Court. And as president, he tested the boundaries of every norm. And certainly in journalism, it's been a major test for us. And I think it's taken journalists a really long time to understand how the weaknesses in our system that had been created over a number of decades, how he was exploiting those weaknesses. And the two ways you see this showing up in traditional political coverage is one right now with this debate over platforming Trump. And in the last few months, there's basically been a loose agreement among TV networks that they don't take Trump live anymore, right? So if you remember on CNN, they did a town hall with Trump with Caitlin Collins, and it was considered, kind of a disaster. And there was a lot of, not because of Caitlin, I think she's a great journalist, she did a great job, but if you were one-on-one, if you're just sitting here with Trump, he's going to just say a lot of stuff that's not true. It's impossible to fact check someone like that in real time. And now all the live networks have decided that that is not a newsworthy thing to do anymore. And I know maybe that sounds like an obvious thing, but that's been years of debate between among journalists about that. And that's a big change. I think the other thing in day-to-day coverage, like the conversations we have in our newsrooms, is, all right, this is not Gore, Bush, 2000. This isn't, McCain, Obama, or pick your kind of Republican Democrat battle of the last few decades. The rules have changed, and we need to respond without being partisan, without, in other words, treating Trump somehow differently from a partisan perspective. And I think the big thing right now, considering some of what happened on January 6th, considering some of the things that Trump has said more recently, considering the sort of fear of that Trump could really, really challenge the foundations of democracy, right? Not to be too grandiose, but those kind of issues are now part of American politics in a way they were not before. These ideas about authoritarianism and weakening democracy, and a lot of Trump supporters saying explicitly that democracy is broken. And there's this whole, I don't know if everyone's familiar with it, but there's a whole stream of thought about, how you need a Caesar right now in American politics to sort of take control, fix things, and then we'll go back to being a democracy. That's a real thing right now among conservative populists in America. And so knowing all that, how do we change our coverage, right? So the shorthand for this is, don't just do on the one hand, on the other hand style political journalism. And, in my newsroom, the way we talk about it a lot is reminding voters, reminding the American public of what the stakes are in the election, right? So focusing a little bit less on the character of Trump and the weirdness and zaniness, which frankly, I love covering that stuff, and I've always loved doing that, taking pleasure in the weird side of American politics. I'm sure that's one reason American politics is really popular to watch in Australia. It's a little bit of a reality TV show sometimes. So I think it's like remembering that it's maybe not the moment for that. And what are the stakes? What are the stakes? So when you're writing about this election, keep that front and center. That may all seem very obvious, but Trump has really pushed us to sort of think about that in all of our coverage all the time.
Great. Just to follow up that very thoughtful response with maybe something less thoughtful, but you two have spoken to Trump individually, like you've interviewed Trump a few times, right? And so you've met him personally, you've gone to Mar-a-Lago and seen him, plus elsewhere. Can you just walk us through what is it actually like to interview Trump when you're meeting him? What is he like in person? Presumably the cameras are off, but he knows that you're going to write down what you say. Is he constantly saying, "Okay, this is off the record, but here's this"? Is he showing you classified documents? Is he? What is it actually like in person when you're actually talking to Trump?
It's just like this.
It's very normal. It depends on you get a few different Trumps in my experience. Occasionally you get a Trump that's very subdued. He's not angry, he's not blustery, he's not funny. He's just sort of even to the point of maybe you wonder if he's medicated or something, because there's not kind of a natural rise and fall, and his intonation is kind of off. That's a strange Trump to get. It's not what you'd be expecting. More often, he's sort of avuncular, and I think if he especially feels like public opinion is not with him, that's when he's really trying to get your approval, and trying to bring you into his point of view, trying to really convince you of whatever his version of reality is at that moment. And then if it gets contentious, well, he does not handle that well at all. And that's sort of more in line with like the classic Trump persona, I think, that people are familiar with from reading the American press or from watching him in television interviews. But I think it's very different. He is a performer. He wanted to be in the movie business. He succeeded in the American reality television business. He succeeded as a media star. And so he's a very different person when he knows that he's making television. versus when he's trying to get a point across in print media. There was this great clip. There was a documentary made about him. I can't remember what it was called, but the documentarians had access to him sort of through the end of the presidency. And there's this one clip where he sits down to film an interview with them. And there's a kind of side table with a glass of water and a napkin, this white napkin on this walnut table. And he's looking in the monitor at the shot, and he starts to produce the shot. And before the interview starts, he's like, oh no, we have to move this. Someone take this napkin. He rearranges everything, and he makes the shot look better. Frankly, it looked a lot better. And that element of it is gone when you're sitting down with him for print. But he doesn't really, I've had him go off the record maybe once or twice in half a dozen interviews, which is strange. But I guess it makes sense with his personality.
And no, I think that's a good description, and it kind of captures. We did a joint interview with him in Mar-a-Lago, and those three elements kind of capture the pace of the interview. At the beginning, it was like he was talking so low, and it was just he was asking questions, trying to find points. We're both from the New York area, so he's trying to find points of commonality, and it was very normal. And then it was sort of avuncular in terms of like jokey stuff. And then when we got into the nitty gritty, it was, various monologues and anger about this issue or that. And the way, now that I'm just sitting here thinking about it, you walk into an interview like that, and if he doesn't know too much about you, you're a mark. And he's trying to figure out, all right, am I going to be able to bullshit? How much bullshit can I get away with here? Let me figure out what kind of person this is. What's their, are they a Trump hater? Do they kind of like Trump? Are they right wing? Are they left wing? He's just trying to like figure you out, and like a 3-card Monte player, and just figure out what he can get away with. And then usually he gets into he gets his back up when he realizes like, they're not going to be an ally. They're not going to be some kind of lapdog person. And so I'm just going to have to like fight them,
And it is sort of like dealing, and I don't say this in an ideological way, but it is dealing with a wild animal. You're sort of trying to figure out how much you should interject when he's saying something that is obviously untrue. For my purposes, for like a print interview, for our purposes, we were interviewing him for a book that we're writing. You want to keep him talking, and you want to stay in the room because you want to get as much material as possible. You want to get to all the questions that you have. You want to learn as much as you can when you're there. And so there's this kind of constant thing that you're balancing where you want to interject, you want to follow up when he says something incorrect or when he mischaracterizes events, but you don't want, he's so sensitive to any perceived criticism or to anything that's at risk of shattering his reality. You don't want to make him so defensive that the interview becomes just an argument and it becomes useless and he ends it. So you're sort of doing that dance the whole time.
I'd forgotten one thing. I remember we called a lot of people just for advice on how they would approach an interview like this. And we sort of took this advice for the most part, which is why it's like, okay, this is a print interview. This is not an interview where if we were on camera, we would not have done this. And, but a lot of people who had studied Trump psychologically that we respect said that, the way to talk to him is constant flattery. The way you'll get information, the way he will reveal something is you have to keep flattering him, just like, yeah. So we did try that a little bit. It gets exhausting after a while. You just want to like interject.
Yeah, what do you say?
But also I was like, I don't want any cameras around because if anyone is watching us do this interview.
I mean, you have to assume that he's recording everything. And I always assume that in the White House as well, that any interaction that you're having with him, he's recording. He might release to embarrass you. Another country might release it. Who knows, right?
Happen where he secretly recorded?
But I mean, I'm assuming, the Nixon comparisons really just write themselves. And so I just assumed. And I thought it was safest to operate that way. But we were kind of framing things as, wow, you did something really historic. No one's ever done things as historic as you did. Tell us about that. That was a big deal, that type of thing.
And sorry, as a former journalist, last question, then we can move on to broader U.S. politics stuff. But what do you think the media if anything, gets wrong about Trump now? He's been in the public eye for decades, especially from New York since the 80s, but really on the national scene since 2016. Do you think the media has adjusted? Like you said, people now have literal psychological tools for interviewing now, right? There's been a progression, you could say, especially if you look at early interviews versus like Jonathan Swan's interview on HBO, which is
you could not, what we were describing, you would never do in a set piece 15-minute televised interview.
Yeah,
that's a whole different beast, right?
Yeah,
so you wouldn't take this method. So you have to think about like how much time do you have with this person. This is for any interview, frankly.
But I guess in terms of like
just
the coverage
distinction,
Yeah, I mean, I think it gets complicated. We were talking about starving him of live coverage, right? And before this sort of ban on taking an interview live began, already no networks, with the exception sometimes of Fox News, were taking his rallies live. That was really a relic of 2016 that stopped quite a long time ago because
in 2016, even CNN would show just the empty podium.
Yeah, everyone would show
until his plane arrived.
Yeah. And it continued into the White House. And I think it's sort of naive. I mean, in 2016, when he was running in the primary, the Huffington Post did this thing that some of you might remember, where they announced that they were not going to cover Donald Trump in their news and politics sections. They were only going to cover him in their entertainment sections. And that didn't quite pan out, I think, the way that they wanted it to. But I
eventually had to switch him to politics.
They did. It was pretty demoralizing. But I don't know. I think that all of these sort of cosmetic fixes is really the media kidding itself about how much authority we have and when we really should be intervening, and whether or not we really should be gatekeepers in that way.
Exactly. How is it not a double standard?
I think it's I think it's sort of irresponsible. It's definitely condescending. I think you can contextualize someone and offer that analysis beforehand, after, but the idea that people cannot be exposed, the innocent virgin ears of the American public cannot be exposed to this man who's been around for 40 years in public life, and who we've all heard from again and again and again for the last decade at least. I think it's very silly, and I don't think it's going to really matter in the end. And I think it's really more about the anxieties of the American press. After 2016, the press was so worried about, we were being blamed. It was the American media's fault for Donald Trump's election. And I think certainly, especially the really mainstream big organizations have so much anxiety about that and are so image obsessed, so obsessed with optics, that they're really making decisions that are not about how to best inform the public or how to best cover him. It's really about how can we cover him in a way that provides us enough cover that we don't receive credible criticism. So I think that's the big issue that I see.
And if you want to add to that?
No, that's good.
Good.
My view, your question is, what's the press doing wrong? And my view is we're infallible. We're doing everything right.
Very good. All right. Thank you for all the media questions. Now on to the politics. A lot of folks are talking about just overnight, what was it, like 2 a.m. our time here. New York Times came out with a poll with Siena College looking at the swing states, 5 swing states, and the poll is showing that Trump was leading in all of them except for one, I believe. At this time, in the third year before their reelection, Obama had an approval rating of 45%. Clinton had an approval rating of 48%, Reagan 53%, and right now Biden is, and Trump was at 43%. Right now, Biden is at 41%. What makes you think or not think he has a chance? What are you watching in the year ahead? We all know a year's a long time, but
yeah,
it's not looking great for Biden's chances.
I wouldn't say that. I would say it is going to be a close election. There will be lots of polls that will look like this, polls where Trump has a lead, maybe consistently, other polls where Biden has a lead. that's what I'd say in general about polls. You can find polls from this time at other recent presidents who won re-election, but were trailing behind their eventual opponent. It's going to be a very close election. Remember, 2020 was a closer election than 2016. There were about 30,000 votes in 3 states. If you had flipped them in 2020, Donald Trump would be president. In 2016, that number was, I think, 80,000, right? So even though the gap in the popular vote was bigger in 2020. So there's no reason to think it's going to be any different next year. Biden is unpopular. His approval rating remains in the low 40s, an average of about 40% for weeks, if not months now. And there's a couple of things going on with that. One is the American economy, it has unemployment is low. There are some data points you can point to that make it look very good on paper, but he's still suffering from the post-inflationary period that followed the pandemic. Even though the rate of inflation is getting close to normal, to close to 2%, that doesn't mean prices are back where they were pre-pandemic, and there's no chance that they will be back before the re-election. So he's going to, that's a unique position to be in, a re-election after the first major inflationary period since the 70s, and where he has been focused on just reducing the rate. Most Americans don't care that much about, obviously they want the prices to stop going up, but the price of bread and other staples is higher than it was under Trump. That is going to be a very powerful argument for Donald Trump to point to his pre-inflationary economy and to Biden's improving, but still not where it was, economy. So Trump is going to have a very powerful argument about the economy. And just one other reason why it's going to be close, I think voters are very myopic. A lot of voters who don't pay attention to politics don't really care about some of the stuff that we tend to obsess about with Donald Trump. And they might look back fondly on the Trump economy, the Trump era, forgetting sort of the things that they didn't like compared to what they're experiencing right now. We may also just be living in an era where no national politician can have an approval rating that's much higher than the low 40s. Donald Trump's approval rating is not much better, right? So the Biden line about this is, don't compare me to the almighty, compare me to the alternative. And their bet is that the alternative will be Donald Trump, and they'll have about $1 billion to spend explaining to the public what the stakes are, reminding them of the things they didn't like about Donald Trump, reminding them of some of the things that Biden has done that are quite popular, but voters don't seem to know about. So any snapshot right now is before all of that has happened, right? You can't say Trump's winning now when the election itself, which is what gives the voters all of the information they need to decide this thing, when that hasn't happened yet, right? So that's important. The other thing is there'll be lots of events that happen between now and election day that we can't predict. So I don't think you can. I think that poll points to a lot of work that Biden needs to do, and it points to some of the groups where he's particularly weak with. But he has a year to solve those problems.
I would also add, Trump is leading, but he is still in the middle of a Republican primary. There are many other competitors vying for the nomination at this point. The coverage of Trump in the mainstream press in the US right now is really focused on the various investigations and criminal probes and the like. And if you were like a liberal watching MSNBC in the US, you would not come away from a typical program with the impression that the threat of a Trump nomination and a Trump presidency was upon you. You would think Trump's in a lot of trouble, which he is. Things are really chaotic around Trump, which they are. But I don't think that you would come away thinking that the Trump era is not nearly over, and that he's a real threat. And I have to imagine that because Biden is going to be running such a Trump-focused campaign, he's just going to be running in opposition to Trump more so than he is making a positive case for his presidency. If last time is any guide, I think that has to hurt him a bit right now, because people aren't really thinking, maybe there's some fondness because people are not thinking about the reality of the Trump administration, all of the things that perhaps they were sick of before, after 4 years.
The number one thing people say about Joe Biden, including amongst his own supporters, is his age. And there's all sorts of quasi leaks about Dems, like in DC, and even some White House people saying, yeah, Biden's older. Can you maybe give us some idea of, like, is that something that you find White House folks and administration folks are actually talking about, like, oh man, Biden is properly older? Or do you think that's something that's blown up or overemphasized?
I mean, there's no doubt the polling shows that is the number one concern voters have about Biden is his age. And I mean, pretty good reasons. I mean, we've never had a president this old, and it's unusual for someone that age to be running for re-election. And so, you've got to put that in the bucket with these other things we talked about as serious issue Biden needs to overcome. Now, I think the question he faced about whether, given his age and given voters' doubts about him because of his age, was it better for him to keep the Democratic Party relatively stable, stay on, make sure that there were no primary challengers, and run the kind of race they know how to run, which they did in 2020, and they did a version of in the midterms in 2022. And sort of, I'm quite sure in Biden's head, he believed this, that whatever the downsides of his age, the upside is that he knows how to beat Trump. He did it twice, and he'll do it again. And the age thing we'll just have to take care of with politics. So the alternative would have been for him to say he's not running for re-election, open up the Democratic primary. You would have had 20 different candidates running. You would have had a lot of issues right now that are sort of bottled up on the Democratic side, a lot of hot button cultural issues, Democrats trying to go to the left with each other on issues like immigration, abortion, trans rights. And it would have, right now in the middle of primary, they'd be arguing over Israel and Palestine. And it would be a messy free-for-all. And I think his view was, just don't have that debate. That will make the party stronger, and they'll fight it out on the age issue.
I do think that's very generous to Joe Biden, though. I don't think I have to assume, given that this is now the fourth time that he'll be running for president total.
He likes running for president.
He likes running for president, and no politician, once they've been elected president, wants to give up that power, right? So I have to imagine it's more about Joe Biden, Joe Biden's legacy, and the Democratic Party and its strength is certainly a part of that legacy.
It's a hell of a bet. If he's wrong.
But I would also point out, though, I mean, in 2020, Biden had the benefit of running during a pandemic, and the Republicans called it, derisively, the basement strategy. He was not out on the campaign trail, right, because people were not out. Donald Trump was out there eventually in a sort of pared back form with these airplane hangar rallies. But Biden was not being heard from very often. And I think that probably helped with some of the anxieties that people have about his age. It's not just a fact of his age, right? It's how he seems and how lucid he seems and how capable of going toe to toe with Trump, or just of doing the job of being president every day. And sometimes he seems great, and sometimes he doesn't seem so great. And I think it'll be harder this time for the Biden campaign to avoid having to have him in public and questioned in public forums like last time.
There are enough of these moments, though, that Olivia just alluded to. And I noticed that on Sky News here in Australia, they love playing these clips. And it really made me aware of the power of how you could take a bunch of Biden's senior moments in public. I'm sure you've all seen these, and turn this into a very powerful caricature of him that is, Sky News does like segments on this every night, I noticed here. And they're, it looks stuff, I don't know if it's all taken out of context, it's hard to know, but if you look at it without knowing a lot, he can be made to look very old and feeble. And they're going to have to explain that and fight that as much as they can. And it doesn't look great.
Yeah, and I think also
a visual medium, it's a tough thing for him to overcome.
And I think the fact that they are so reluctant to have him really out there, they don't make him available a lot for interviews. He's just not as public of a president as Trump was, or certainly that Obama was. I think that sort of leaves a lot of space for his opponents to project that caricature of him as a feeble old guy, because he's not filling that space with his own version of himself, if that makes sense.
And yeah, and that's such a good point. And this debate has finally hit a different, we're at a different moment with this debate suddenly. And I think it's this poll today is a very notable exchange on Twitter, of course, between David Axelrod, the main strategist for Barack Obama, who's always been sort of like at odds a little bit, or sort of on the peripheries of the Biden world. He's not a Biden insider. He, after this New York Times poll came out, said something like, it's time for only Joe Biden can make this decision, but he needs to seriously assess whether the better thing is for him to not run for re-election. Now that might not sound like a big deal, but in insider DC, that's a big moment, that the leading Democratic strategist, the architect of the Obama-Biden victory and re-election, is basically saying Biden should reconsider whether he should run again. And Ron Klain, sort of the Axelrod of the Biden campaign and his former chief of staff, very quickly kind of smacked Axelrod on Twitter. So you had like the most important Biden strategist and the most important Obama strategist fighting in public about this question. It's really the first time that people at that level are even like talking about this. And of course, the Representative Dean Phillips in public. Privately, it's the only thing Democrats have talked about for a year.
And I would just point out, I mean, there is a primary, it barely exists, but it is happening. There are two candidates now in the Democratic primary. Marianne Williamson, who's polling now at 16%, with no advertising, no media coverage at all in the mainstream press.
But
and
great
now
vibes.
great vibes.
I thought
Great
she talked about like vibes.
Very new agey.
and frankly, a very serious policy platform. And I'm serious. She has a very serious policy platform, and everyone likes.
Olivia's making a documentary about her.
I spent a lot of time with her.
She spent a lot of time with her.
But people like to laugh because of the new age thing. But if you spend a lot of time listening to all the other candidates of both parties, she articulates a very compelling case on the policy level and just politically. And then Dean Phillips, a congressman from, where is he from? Minnesota, who's now polling at about 10%. He got in the race last week.
His strategy is a version of what happened in 1968 when LBJ was unpopular because of Vietnam. McCarthy jumped in that race, and it eventually convinced Bobby Kennedy to get in the race because it showed that LBJ was weak. And a lot of people think if he wasn't assassinated, Bobby Kennedy would have won that race and had a decent shot at beating Nixon. We'll never know. But so Dean Phillips, he said for months he doesn't want to run. He just wanted someone else to run. So he's kind of getting the debate that he said he wanted, and that this New York Times poll has precipitated. Democrats talking publicly about it. In his view, the next step is for him to show some movement in the polls. What happens if he gets 35% in a poll? Suddenly the press will start saying, oh, Biden is really weak. Does that create an opening where other people like Axelrod start talking about, maybe Joe Biden shouldn't run? And then that creates, some of these Democratic governors to rethink their support for Biden and jump in the race.
But
I think it's a low chance of that happening, but it's in the, 10% range,
The difficulty in large part is that the DNC has a process where even if you're on the ballot in many states, you can't really accrue delegates. There's no path forward for anyone except for Joe Biden.
They made it hard.
So they made it very difficult. Yeah. It's very difficult. It's very expensive. And so they're not acknowledging that there is any primary. And I think they'd like to keep it that way. So I think unless Dean Phillips were suddenly polling at 30%, there'd really be no public outcry for a debate or for a change in the rules that would force him to behave any differently.
Yeah, I guess what I'm trying to say is things can happen very fast. David Axelrod going from just holding his tongue silent like every other Democratic strategist and politician, to all of a sudden today saying that maybe Joe Biden shouldn't run for re-election. You know, that's, nobody would have predicted that recently, and that's a big change. Dean Phillips, a Democratic member of the House, you know, relatively unknown guy, him jumping into the primary, things can change very, very fast.
The latest in a long line of Minnesotans wanting to run for president and failing. You're touching on the issue of Biden being the transition candidate. I mean, I'm old enough to remember in 2020, pre-South Carolina, when his team, he hadn't won anything yet in his entire career. He'd never won a state.
Yeah.
And his team at times they were wondering if they had enough to, you know, make payroll. And they were talking about, okay, he'll just be a one-term candidate. I don't think Biden said this publicly, but it just became known that his team was shopping that around to try to get some Democratic support in the primaries.
Yeah. I reported this. This is what you're referring to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for reporting that. So I won't ask you your sources for that, but I will ask, who does come next and what does that look like? Does he talk about who he thinks his heir apparent will be? Obviously, Kamala Harris would have been the logical next one, but it seems like she's one of the few politicians in DC of a lower approval rating than the president himself. So what is transition to whom?
It's a good question. What do you think?
I mean, not Hunter Biden, I would guess. I don't know. I mean, I think there are a lot of people waiting in the wings. You have the kind of Pete Buttigieg's of the world, people who maybe didn't perform very well last time for a variety of reasons, who will definitely want to take another go of it. In American politics, people tend to run for president many times and sort of never really leave that debate. It's the easiest way to generate attention, to get yourself booked on TV, to get yourself a book contract, to get yourself a paid speaking gig, or just increase your consulting rate doing whatever it is that you want to do. So we have a sort of screwed up system where there's a lot of incentive for people to run again and again and again. But I think someone like Pete Buttigieg is certainly biding his time, trying not to have too many disasters at the Department of Transportation until he can run again. I mean, he'll probably do it.
I mean, I think the two biggest stars that you hear about that Democrats seem excited about are Gavin Newsom, the governor of California. You guys are probably familiar with him, and Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan. That's, you know, you never know what these candidates who are hyped would be like as presidential candidates, but they're a little bit like Ron DeSantis was last year. They're considered the two next generation stars. And so if in the unlikely event Biden takes David Axelrod's advice and decides, okay, yeah, there should be a Democratic primary after all, I'm not going to run, they would be ready to jump in. And then Kamala Harris herself, as vice president, presumably would also run. That would be a very awkward situation. I think one of the reasons why Biden didn't want to deal with this, or at least it made it easier for him to decide that he should run for re-election, is, you know, what does he do about Kamala? Does he support her? She's going to be running in an open primary. It was a very messy, complicated issue that he wanted to avoid. So it's easy for him to justify it.
And there's a lot of wishful thinking among Democrats, just as there is among Republicans, where they talk about Gavin Newsom. Oh, maybe he could come in and save the day. Maybe he could get put in during the convention somehow. The same way that Republicans talk about, oh, maybe it's not too late for Glenn Youngkin, who's the governor of Virginia, to get into the race. There's still a few weeks left for him to get in and get on the ballot and maybe make a showing in Iowa. It's just not realistic at this point for that to happen. And I think it'd be very hard for a Democratic candidate to have a real nomination securing operation starting from scratch.
On Youngkin, there's going to be an election. Virginia has weird elections, off-year elections. So Virginia, he's the governor of, he's the Republican governor of Virginia. There's going to be an election tomorrow. Well, yeah, tomorrow on Tuesday in the US. And he's sort of it's a race, it's a state house race. Republicans have a chance of taking back the state house. If they do, he'll take credit for it. And some people have said that he's waiting for Tuesday's election, see how well Republicans do, and might use that as a springboard to jump in and challenge Donald Trump. And he's sort of been waiting to see the other candidates fall by the wayside and have a dramatic entrance into the primary. So there'll be some noise about that in the coming days.
One question to you is, if Biden is to win, what do you then focus as journalists as covering? Like having covered now a few presidencies, and especially Ryan having covered a number of second-term presidents, how does that shift? What do you, like, we can talk forever about what do you think the priorities will be, but what in terms of their legislative or like a lot of times they get jammed up at home, so they do foreign policy. But like, what do you want to actually cover in a second Biden term? What do you think are the things that are important to report on?
Well, I mean, so much of it depends on boring things like what's the makeup of Congress. Does he have a majority in Congress or not? That'll determine whether he has a chance at a serious legislative agenda or not, and how much time he decides to focus on foreign policy instead. He likes foreign policy more than domestic policy in a lot of ways. So I think you can expect his Biden's second term to even be more foreign policy focused than your typical second-term president, especially given the number of crises in the world. Domestically, if you look at the first-term package in the first year, I don't know if you all remember this, but the Democrats did something kind of interesting. They basically threw everything. I mean, literally everything that Democrats talked about in the primaries, with the exception of immigration reform. It really wasn't part of this. They threw into a very, very large package in the first year. They fought for as long as they could until they had to sort of prioritize a little bit more and take probably from a cost-wise about half of that package, maybe even more than that, out. So if you just go back to that original list, that's kind of still the Democratic agenda. And if you ask the Biden folks, like for second-term priorities, they'll usually sort of point to what got left on the cutting room floor: money for childcare, some healthcare expansions. On the climate side of things, the climate stuff that they passed tended to be all carrots. There was stuff more on the stick side of things that didn't get in there. A larger infrastructure bill. I'm probably leaving out some really important stuff. Immigration reform, which is just this sort of perennial issue that Democrats can't ever seem to address. What else? Off the top of my head, those are the biggies.
Do you want anything? On the flip side of that, if Trump loses the 2024 election, let's not forget. So he won 2016, as you said, 75,000 votes, but he lost the popular vote by 2 million. Then he went on to lose his first midterms with a plus 41 seats to the Dems or something ridiculously high. Then he lost the 2020 election to Biden. And then Biden's first midterms, the Republicans only gained 9 seats, which is below the average of 30 something.
Yeah.
If he loses 2024, is he done? That's 2018, 2020, 2022, where he's either lost or done far worse than before. Do you think he's done, or is it just lifetime ownership of the Republican Party?
That's a good question. He's sort of the interesting thing in talking about him in the immediate aftermath of his 2020 loss and the insurrection was just how clearly he views politics as sort of his retirement hobby. I mean, he's just meddling in American politics. He does it the way that you would like bet on sports or you would go to the racetrack or something. He's really obsessed with sort of gaming it all out. And I guess it appeals to all of his sort of base instincts and his desire for attention and adulation. So I have a hard time imagining that he would just give it up and,
Yeah.
retreat fully to the golf course. But I assume he would continue to threaten that he would run again. And he would probably continue to hold rallies here or there. He loves doing those. It's like, it's like he's on tour, basically. But if he would actually mount a campaign, I have a harder time envisioning that, but I don't think it's impossible. I think he might threaten to run or might literally run for the rest of his life. But whether the Republican Party would stick with him after another loss, and depending on the outcome of these various proceedings against him, there's a very real possibility that he could be in jail in the next year. I think that would determine that a bit, but the Republicans have shown repeatedly that a lot of things that would make them run away from any other political leader, it just doesn't work that way for them with Trump. He has a very strange hold over them. And I think they're all sort of humbled by his political power. They all have lived in fear of, a single comment from him derailing their entire political careers. They live in fear of sort of being cyberbullied by him. And they're used to him determining what their politics looks like for the last, 7 years now, 7.5 years. So I'm sure there would still be Republicans who are modeling themselves in his image, even if he is literally in jail. And like you see now in the primary, people like Vivek Ramaswamy or Ron DeSantis in his own way, who are really modeled after him, even aesthetically, the way that they dress or the way that they talk or the issues that they talk about. I assume people will think that it's possible to replicate the kind of magic quality that he has that makes him so compelling.
If he's not in jail, he'll run again.
Forever.
That's my view.
Just omnipresent
I think
campaign.
he's in jail. I mean, he can do it once. He might be in jail next fall during the campaign. Don't forget that.
Right.
But I think if he loses while in jail, I think that may be his last campaign. But maybe he'll find a unique way to run from prison that.
This is actually the plot of a movie called A Face in the Crowd. Have any of you ever seen it? There's a guy who becomes a populist radio show phenom from prison. And he becomes this touring hero all across America. Everyone loves him until he's caught on a hot mic saying something like, "These idiots who come to see me, can you believe this?" And finally everyone moves away from him. But he did become a populist hero from prison. So at least in our art, it is possible.
Last question before opening up to the audience. If Trump wins and presumably wins both House, that they maintain or expand the GOP lead in the House, and probably regardless, the Senate goes to the Republicans. I think even if Biden wins, it's more likely than not because just where the Senate is right now. It's hard to imagine we're going to have Democratic senators from Ohio for much longer. What are you looking at? What are you focusing on to understand what happens next? Like one thing that I've asked is like Mitch McConnell, the Senate Minority Leader, and Mike Johnson, the now Speaker of the House, who no one had heard of 3 weeks ago, including the nerds, myself included.
There would have been no reason to know who he is.
Yeah. Right. Like, are you watching that dynamic?
Just think of some completely backbench MP, and like that. There's no reason that you would ever need to know Mike Johnson.
Yeah,
there's 435, members of the House, so you can't know all of them. And
right.
We weren't covering or knowing who Mike Johnson was.
Right, but like, are you watching that dynamic? What are you focused on in a second Trump term in terms of reporting? And are the most important things to understand what happens next? I mean, we were talking before about how Jonathan Swan is now writing up a whole series at the Times, and maybe you can explain that. And
I mean, I don't even know where to begin. One, is the new president in prison or is he in the White House? Two, are any of the criminal trials still ongoing, or were they all finished before his election? And how do prosecutors deal with that? Did his trials end, but the sentencing stage didn't happen because there were delays? Did he win legitimately, or was it a coup executed in a more professional way than the January 6th insurrection? I'm just like throwing out things
Right,
because
yeah.
we have to be very creative.
I like the
And-
criticism of the insurrection as
I'm
unprofessional.
just saying, you get, how did he attain power? Do the Democrats in any way believe that the election was unfair and it's a contested election?
'Cause I think in 2016, what percentage of Democrats thought that the election was stolen? I think it was,
I don't have a number,
don't
but
know.
I mean,
yeah.
Democratic leadership, I mean, the former candidate and a lot of prominent Democrats to this day will say that Russia was involved and that it was stolen. So
Oh, you mean that? Yeah.
yeah. So I think, when Republicans talk about, oh, this happens on both sides, they're not wrong that does happen. It's just there was no coup attempt.
Yeah. So then I think his whole campaign at the rallies, you were talking about the rallies before, the thing he talks about the rallies most is how he's personally being treated. He's made the criminal cases against him the centerpiece of his campaign. And that's been very effective in a Republican primary. I think most people think in a general election, if that's what he's running on, that's probably not a successful campaign message. It's just talking about how unfair it is that he's being prosecuted for so many crimes, right? That doesn't translate into the general election. That seems to be it seems like there will be a dumb strategy. There was some evidence in 2022 that when he wasn't as effective in some of these states where he campaigned because he wasn't talking to issues people cared about. He's just talking about himself. But if he wins, he's promised to, sort of take apart the Justice Department root and branch, and it will be a scorched earth campaign against any of his critics or anyone that had anything to do with the two federal cases. And he's been very clear about that. There's a lot of work going into thinking about how to fire as many federal employees as you can, given the current rules. There's a lot of Trump adjacent folks thinking about that. So all this stuff about dismantling the deep state, that's going to be a very, very high priority. He'll probably have Congress. He hasn't really put forward a legislative agenda yet. Last time he kind of outsourced that to Republican leaders in Congress. So in a lot of ways, the sort of pre-Trump legislative agenda is what dominated in his first year. Like, the tax cut was the big centerpiece. I think he might have a more, because there's more people thinking about this stuff, a more sort of populist Trumpy legislative agenda, because there are people who are trying to make Trumpism more meaningful ideologically. So it's not just the pre-Trump agenda that dominates on Capitol Hill. But the first thing in the first year, it's going to be vengeance against the deep state. I think that's the easiest way to describe it.
I think it'll be two things. I think it'll be vengeance and sort of rewriting the last several years to the extent that he thinks that he can. But I also think he never got like the big thing done last time. There were the tax cuts, but he has a sort of childlike approach to the world and wants to talk about space and the moon and all of these things. I think he would spend a lot of money trying to get like a legacy project done. So I think it'd be a combination of trying, probably failing.
Infrastructure Week.
Infrastructure Week, never forget. I think it'd be a combination of sort of trying and failing to, get people on Mars and trying and possibly succeeding in completely dismantling the justice system in the US.
So Space Force gets a big budget.
Yeah.
Finally get those
Good.
tanks in the parade. He wanted the tank.
Oh yeah, that's right. Like the French.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah,
Like
he saw that in France and he thought, why can't we have this?
There you go.
Yeah.
All right, so with that, I will now open up to the audience. And again, we're doing questions, not comments. So if you could just raise your hand, we have a mic over here. So we'll start right here. If you want to just wait for the microphone for my colleague Jacob.
Just to pick up on something you said, after the result in 2016, you said the media was blamed for Trump's win. Who blamed you? Republicans were obviously very happy. So was it just the Democrats?
Well,
or was it other
Republicans
media?
didn't thank people in the media, certainly. Which now that you mention it, if they thought that they should have. But no, it was mostly, I mean, among the mainstream press, a lot of readers and viewers are sort of, left of center. And so at a place like the New York Times, for instance, the Times became sort of held captive to this audience that continued to think that they were not doing enough to stop Trump, that their coverage did not editorialize enough, that they were not using strong enough language. There was a big campaign at one point. It was not just about the Times, it was about... Pardon? Yeah, so the big debate is basically that reporters at the press think that objectivity exists and can be achieved and is a good thing to achieve. I don't personally agree with that. And the debate that they should intervene more and use more sort of activist language, and which has historically not been the case. It's not been what people have argued about the press. And it made for a very, awkward couple of years where there was sort of constantly this expectation that you had to justify. Pardon? Well, Fox News is not an actual news outlet. Fox News is an activist arm of the conservative movement.
No, I think we're touching on something that was broader in the media. Like, for example, if a politician says an outright lie multiple times in an interview, do you say he or she lied multiple times? Do you say mistruth? Do you what do you actually focus on? So I think it was sort of like journalistic practices. And one thing that we were talking about earlier is, for example, or really just how Trump in many ways saved journalism, a lot of outlets, because of the eyeballs that he brought, right? So the New York Times, Washington Post, CNN.
So those eyeballs are very valuable. And so a lot of these news organizations, especially news organizations that rely on subscribers, when I say they became captive, I mean, those subscribers have a lot of sway. They're keeping everybody in business. They're making business boom. And so whether or not they, quit subscribing in protest matters quite a lot. And so those sorts of opinions, I think, were taken much more credibly than they might have been in another environment.
All right, we'll start from the back right in front of you, Jacob.
You're suggesting that Trump is looking for a legacy project and to remembered by. May I perhaps suggest, as part of an infrastructure project, he may wish to add an extra person to Mount Rushmore. I think he'd be quite acceptable to that. Next time you speak to him, perhaps you could suggest that to him. That's not my serious question. My serious question is, you mentioned that Joe Biden is not so young, and that should he win the election, do you think it's a possibility he may wish to resign halfway through and hand the legacy to Kamala Harris? The upside being she'd be the first female. Hillary didn't do so well, nor did Jim Ferraro some years ago, and nor did the one from Alaska, Sarah Palin. She'd be the first. Is she Hispanic? Is she or Indian? Kamala Harris? Yeah, but she certainly tick a number of progressive boxes. Do you think it's a possibility, should he win, Biden, and given his age, he would find a nice exit strategy to leave halfway through his term and hand it to Kamala? Sorry.
No, I don't. You have to understand how much Joe Biden loves being president and how he's thought and dreamed about being president since he was a young man, and
Like
how
a teenager.
Yeah, living as with the Kennedys as his model, and running and thinking about running in basically every election since 1980. It's been on his mind whether he jumped in or not. He likes presidenting, and he's more, I think he thinks of himself as the person who went into the job knowing more about it than any predecessor, right? 8 years as vice president, but 40 years in the Senate. And I think I just don't see a scenario where he convinces himself that it's the better thing to do for the country or the Democratic Party for him to step down unless he's truly in bad shape.
I also think just taking that thought exercise to its conclusion, I don't think that it would lead to sort of universal acclaim for him. I think it would probably be viewed as very condescending and not how you operate in a democracy. And so I don't think, even though, yes, it is in line with Joe Biden's personality, he wants to be an ally to voters of color. He talks a lot about his involvement, his support for the civil rights movement. That is something in theory that Joe Biden would like to get credit for in history, but I don't see it working either practically and having positive reverberations for the Democratic Party, and I don't see it working practically in that I don't think that he, under any circumstance, would consciously give up power.
You previously brought up David Axelrod and saying how him explicitly talking about passing on the torch would is the thing to do given these polls. But I'll note that I think on November 1, I was actually just listening to a podcast that he does with a few other pollsters or former political operatives. And he said, if Biden were to pass on the mantle now, he would be lauded as a hero. And but again, it's just like,
To Kamala?
He didn't say to whom, but
Oh, interesting. So you heard Axelrod in a podcast preview what he said today.
Exactly. Yeah, but not explicitly. He didn't say he should. He said if he were to, right? So I think he was teasing it. But again, I think it's different between the hypothetical and the actual who are you?
I think that would throw the White House even into more doubt than it is now. I think it's much easier to envision an incumbent president than it is to envision someone who's never been in the Oval Office, like, Gavin Newsom or whoever it would be.
Yeah.
I've kind of flipped my view of this, just is like, I used to think like, yeah, Biden's probably right, a chaotic Democratic primary versus him running. It's a safer bet that Democrats retain the White House by just sticking with the incumbent because there's such powers with incumbency. I don't know, I started to rethink it that maybe a messy Democratic primary wouldn't be the worst thing. They'd have some new shiny candidate at the end of 3-4 month process.
They had that last time and they got Joe Biden.
and that's that someone without the baggage, but you could argue this all day.
All right, next question. We'll go to this side, maybe right in front of you, Janine, because we haven't hit this side of the room yet. Thank you.
Thank you. What sort of impact do you think that independent candidates like RFK Jr. will have on the race? And I've got a second question as well. Influence of non-mainstream media, like the likes of Tucker Carlson and X, will influence the outcome?
I think when you look at the rise of RFK, it's sort of about the rise of independent media, right? He is not, prior to recently, was not really being covered or given a lot of time to explain himself in the mainstream press because he is a conspiracy theorist who I think the press determined long ago it was so risky to talk to him because he was trafficking in all of these crazy ideas about AIDS or about vaccines and autism. But on places like Joe Rogan's podcast or Jordan Peterson's podcast or my friend Barry Weiss's podcast, he's allowed free reign and he can talk as much as he wants and say whatever he wants. And there's a huge portion of the American public that loves those types of forums, that listens exclusively to those types of things and does not get their news from the New York Times or from New York Magazine or from Politico. And they're really open to people like him, or whether it's him or it's Cornel West. And so I think however poorly or however well he performs will probably be determined by how strong that independent media is at the end of the day. We've never really had an election where the mainstream media is less important than the one that we're in now, arguably.
But if he's on the ballot, then he will break out of the kind of alternative media ghetto, and he will be, the mainstream media will cover him the way that we covered Ross Perot in 1992. So getting on the ballot as a third party candidate is very difficult in most states in the United States. The rules are kind of been created by the two parties to exclude third parties. And so he has a lot of work to do. It's all this very, this manual process of getting signatures. And in some states, they make you get a certain number of signatures in every congressional district, and the deadlines are different in every congressional district. It requires big, sophisticated operation. Ross Perot, had a lot of money he could spend on it. Arguably, it's a little bit easier now with the internet, and just it's easier to sort of attract a big network to do that. But say he gets on the ballot and Cornel West gets on the ballot in a number of important states, it's going to be a big, complicated election. Right now, RFK takes more from Trump than from Biden. That's been the big change in his base since he started. The Democrats all abandoned him, and Fox News built him up, I think partly as a way to hurt Biden. And all of a sudden, it turns out his fans are on the populist conservative right. They're like Trump people.
And you saw this coming. I mean, the second that he switched his affiliation and started running in October as an independent, the RNC immediately mobilized to start attacking him and saying he's not really a conservative, please don't vote for him, basically. But we were talking the other day in one of these forums about Jill Stein in 2016. And how if you look at the difference between the results of 2016 and the results of 2020, you could argue that the deciding factor was the lack of a third party candidate
in 2020. So it'll matter. But it is fascinating that Kennedy now is the one most likely to be the third party candidate, and he seems to hurt Trump more than Biden. That's a bit of a plot twist here.
All right. So then go here. Work our way forwards.
So in the previous iteration of the Trump campaign and the administration, we had the Steve Bannons, the Stephen Millers, who were
They're still around.
They're still around, obviously, but they're not as they were the ones who were driving the policy and the ideological content of Trumpism. Who are the people we should be focusing now on the Trump team?
Steve Bannon and Steve Miller are still in here.
Yeah. Steve Miller, especially in the wilderness now, is trying to be the kind of intellectual guru of this stuff. He's been working with think tanks and other sort of Trump affiliated people to think through these issues about how do you fire as many federal employees as you want. How do you find more pliable federal judges who are not from the old conservative network of the Federalist Society, who are very, very conservative, but not loyal to the person who appoints them? There's a think tank now called the Claremont Institute that has tried to become the intellectual home of Trumpism.
Wasn't it Michael Anton who wrote the United 93 election, and it was for the Claremont Institute's
That's where Michael Anton is he's really into Caesar these days. So if you read his stuff, this is a strain of thinking now on the populist right, Caesarism, and that the country, his famous anonymous essay in 2016 was the Flight 93
It was under a pseudonym. That's what.
Yeah, he was a mid-level spokesperson at the CIA before that, and so he's had quite a career shift. And the Flight 93 election was his essay about how 2016 was the last chance. If you let the left win, then American democracy, as we all know it, will be over. And that's a very common thing you hear right now in the Trump world. You'll see this expression where Trump intellectuals divide the Republican Party into people who know what time it is and those who don't. And if you know what time it is, you understand the moment of crisis that America is facing and how all of the old rules no longer apply. And that wing of the party are the ones who take this idea of Caesarism more seriously than you would imagine it should be taken, and who think that, you know, this is it, this is the last election. And so if you know what time it is, you know that, and you know that you can cross certain boundaries that maybe previously you couldn't.
And I mean, more directly, the thing about Trump is that nobody ever really leaves his orbit. There have been a few cases where people are really out and they're not on the phone anymore and they're not going to see him. But for the most part, even people who've had really contentious exits from his orbit, they get brought back in, or they worm their way back in one way or another. And so even the people from, 2016 who never got official roles, let's say in the administration, someone like Corey Lewandowski, he was still coming to the White House, taking meetings with Trump. He was still affecting things from the outside. And he's still in touch with him now. That's true of Steve Bannon. It's true of Roger Stone, who's sort of been in and out of Trump's orbit for the last 35 years. And so I think we'll see a lot of, if he does come to power again, I think we'll see a lot of familiar faces. And I think it'll probably work a bit like last time, where he's sort of cycling through people who he's either, blaming for what's happening, or who he hopes will fix the problems that he's creating.
Does that include, do you think, Nikki Haley being a VP? Because that would obviously help with women voters. Obviously, the suburban women voters that Trump doesn't do as well with. Do you think that's any?
I think it's possible. I mean, I think she would take it in a second.
Really?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's no doubt in my mind.
Yeah. I don't think
Split
he
the
would
two
offer
sides.
it.
You wouldn't offer it?
I don't think so. Unless was very attracted to the idea of humbling Nikki Haley, who is
Yeah.
obviously
It's
since.
like similar to the Mitt Romney, Mike Pence, like you stay
Yeah.
in your place.
Yeah.
I mean, there might, I mean, this Sarah Huckabee Sanders in Arkansas, the governor of Arkansas. She's she's the governor of Arkansas now.
Nepo baby. Yeah.
All right. We have time for
Could be
just
vice president.
a few more questions.
We got to keep it interesting for you guys. So
All right.
you didn't see that coming, did you?
We'll do one question here and then we'll go around. If we could get to even the front here.
This person looks familiar.
I'll make it really quick. So we often talk about Trump and Biden in opposition, naturally. But I'm wondering whether you see us, aside from age or demography, any important similarities between Trump and Biden that are overlooked from your perspective?
Beyond the fact that they're octogenarians who speak
Yes.
with no filters.
I have a
and-
suspicion the answer is their love of presidency, but
Surreal. That's
It's interesting because they are similar in age, but they kind of come from different planets, right? Where Trump, I am from the New York area. A lot of my family members, male family members, remind me quite a bit of Trump. They kind of have the same vocabulary of culture. They were influenced by the same music. They went to the same clubs. It's a type of guy that I'm very familiar with, right? Joe Biden is not from that world. I have a very hard time picturing Joe Biden at any age in Studio 54, right? And they don't seem to kind of share a common. There's no consensus reality for the two of them, as far as I could tell.
yeah, really different. I'm trying to think of anything more than totally superficial that is similar about them,
It's all superficial.
but nothing great for you. It's a good question.
One thing that I find interesting is how much Biden does not mention Trump's name. He says the prior guy,
Yeah.
but then off the record, you'll hear like his team loves to leak how they'll find something Trump did and he'll say what and a blanking blank censored. But yeah, I think behind closed doors, Biden could not be more disgusted with Trump. And
Trump, I mean, from what I would hear during the last election, from Trump's advisors, the way that he talked about Biden was not like with disgust. It was more just confusion.
Like, I
he
can't
did-
believe I'm losing to this guy.
That, but
Yeah,
also
yeah.
just, I don't understand this guy. You know, he said what, or he believes what, or he's wearing that. I mean, it was very superficial because Trump is superficial, but that's, you know, what I got most often.
All right, so we'll go here and then here, and then we'll get you back there. Here behind you.
Two questions, one about Trump and one about Biden. When you're describing the difficulty you had to get through I'm concerned what happens then with foreign leaders when he's trying to negotiate something complicated. The second one is with Biden. How do you get into that mess? I mean, it wasn't as if you couldn't foresee that he was going to be 1,000 years old in 2 years' time. I mean, why you create and then a year before the election, Axel comes up with this wonderful insight. Well, maybe
It's a little late, right? Yeah.
Sorry, just to clarify on your first question, do you mean hard to access Trump to interview him?
I think he means to understand, right? To get through to get
Oh,
into his head.
sorry,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
I think it's a challenge. I think many world leaders have attested to this. But they have the same psychological insights and knowledge that we all do. And I think in the first term, some leaders were quicker to understand Trump and maybe quicker to not care if it was sort of insulting in the way that they viewed him, almost in a sort of infantile, childlike way. The Saudis did a really good job of understanding Trump early on. Putin certainly did, where some of the Western allies, almost out of respect for the American presidency, didn't I don't know, almost didn't want to manipulate him as quickly and as easily as some adversaries realized they could. But I think getting what you want out of Trump will be there's a sort of more of a standard playbook from foreign leaders now, right? Just this mixture of flattery and being and friendship and never criticizing him in public. It's a really easy formula, right? This is not complicated stuff. We all know what he's like. So I think that will be the playbook. And you, Jared, you might have thoughts on this too. And on the second question, Biden, this issue, you're right. This has haunted Biden's candidacy since 2019 when he jumped in the race, and he dealt with it in the primaries by telling people off the record, never publicly, that he would only serve one term. And by constantly telling Democratic voters that he was going to be a bridge to the next generation. And he used that word all the time. The joke is the bridge keeps getting longer and longer and longer. And Kamala Harris was part of that plan. Like, this is, my running mate is the next generation. But he never publicly said that he would not run for a second term. So he never boxed himself in. And I think gradually he and his age just never revisited that question. And he convinced himself that especially when they did better than expected in the midterms, they convinced themselves with some evidence to back them up that he's the only person that can beat Trump. He did it in 2020. He did it in 2022. They know how to run that race. Yes, he's older, but Trump is such a weak candidate after 2020 that they'll figure out the politics of the age thing. And, better Biden takes this on than, Pete Buttigieg. Very easy to talk yourself into that argument. You could see if you're president of the United States. And giving up the advantage of incumbency is a not insignificant thing. Most presidents are reelected. It's rare, Carter and George H.W. Bush since 1980 are the only two that haven't won re-election. So you have enormous advantages. Like, the boring fact of American politics is incumbent presidents win, usually. So you could see why they just decided this was a safer bet.
Right.
Oh, sorry. Yeah,
Yeah,
I did
yeah.
leave that out. I've been leaving that out in a number of discussions this week, actually. So thank you.
Did you want to add anything? Yeah, just very.
You
quick.
say he doesn't win. He didn't win.
I think the Saudis and maybe Putin knew how to play Trump, but I think Asian allies, especially Shinzo Abe, played Trump exceptionally well. And Australia, in my view, if anything, learned from Shinzo Abe how to deal with Trump. I'm so sorry, but we're actually at time.
I'm sorry for my long answer there.
And so we're gonna have to close it there. But thank you so much for coming out tonight. If it's all right, if I can commit you to just 10 more minutes to maybe
Yeah, of course.
formally answer a few
Yeah.
more questions from those in the audience, maybe off mic. But thank you so much for coming out. We're gonna hopefully be doing many more of these in the coming days, but after last week, I'm gonna need a nap. So yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you all. Thank you all for the great questions.
Thanks.